It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. On today's show, Graham Wood from The Atlantic, who writes about the Middle East, on reasons for both concern and paradoxical optimism, as he quotes a well-known Palestinian saying to him, on what comes next for Israelis and Palestinians. And we'll look at the layoffs and then unlayoffs at the Centers for Disease Control the last few days, with a focus particularly on their publication that's the main source of data in the United States on what makes people ill or kills them in this country. Does the Trump administration, after having at least temporarily laid off most of the staff from that publication, really not want to keep track of that? But we begin with our 30 Issues in 30 Days election series. Issue 17 today, closing Rikers Island or not closing Rikers Island as an emerging issue in the New York City mayoral race. Closing it by 2027, if you don't know, is the law. But Curtis Sliwa has always said keep it open. And now Andrew Cuomo wants to keep a jail there too. We'll hear clips of all three candidates' arguments. But here's the one that made news first. It's Cuomo last Wednesday.
We should rebuild new state-of-the-art jails on Rikers Island, provide free bus service, and use those existing sites for housing and commercial development. So
Cuomo last week calling to scrap the construction of 4 borough-based jails, one in each borough except Staten Island is the plan. Use those sites for housing and build a new jail on Rikers Island instead. We'll hear more from Cuomo, plus Mamdani and Sliwa as we go. And we'll do this 30-issue segment a little differently from our other recent ones. You know, we've been mostly having explainers or debates. This is going to be kind of an oral history and point of view by our guest who was part of the de Blasio administration when the closed Rikers plan was created. Our guest is Elizabeth Glazer. She's the founder of the New York City policy journal, Vital City, which is a quarterly and has kind of a think tank associated with it. She's been on the show a number of times in that context the last couple of years. She previously served, though, as the justice advisor to Mayor de Blasio. She was also the New York State Deputy Secretary for Public Safety, State Deputy Secretary, when Andrew Cuomo was governor. So she's got a foot in both of those camps, and she still supports closing Rikers, probably most in line with Zohran Mamdani's current position. But just wanted to say there are all those connections of hers for full disclosure, in addition to her having been a federal prosecutor. So Liz, thanks for coming on for this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks so much, Brian. Glad to be here.
I said this would be part oral history, so tell everybody where the idea to close Rikers first came from and how it got considered and processed by you and Mayor de Blasio as something to take seriously.
Sure. So, I don't think that there's been a time since Rikers has been open when it hasn't been in trouble. It's really hard to remember when it hasn't been under a consent decree and when conditions haven't been terrible. And one of the first things that de Blasio and me and my team did when we first came in is to try and understand why things were so terrible. And in that very first year, the city actually agreed to enter into a consent decree with the federal government. The U.S. attorney had been investigating Rikers and had determined that violence was so out of control that it reached unconstitutional levels and put in what's called a monitor to make sure that that would be fixed. And one of the first things that we did was really look at the population and figure out how many people really need to be in Rikers, and is the population, which is often a driver of violence, the size of the population, is there a way to reduce that, consistent with public safety? And so that was an enormous effort. And then there was a big focus on...
Can I jump right in there for one little note? From what you just said, it means that the plan to close Rikers and improve conditions for people incarcerated in New York City must have intersected with the bail reform movement, because you're talking about jailing
Very
fewer
much
people
so.
in the first place
Very much
before
so.
their trials. And so
Very much
bail
so.
reform, which is its own controversy and its own issue in this 30 issues segment, was part of the plan to close Rikers.
Well, and I would say, bail reform makes it seem like it's just about the law, which was obviously very important, but there really the central question was who needs to be in and who doesn't. We're pretty careless with liberty. People stay in when they have very low bail amounts. They get out when they have very high bail amounts. And so one of the first things, in fact, in the first 6 months that we did was to give judges some option between putting somebody in and letting them go with nothing. And this was the supervised release program, which became very popular with judges and has now grown quite a bit. And again, it's a way to think about how to have the most safety with the lightest touch. So yes, very much, population control, controlling the number of people at Rikers is about how many people go in, and that has partly to do with figuring out options aside from jail, but also critically, and this is what's so important today, is how long they stay. So the amount of time that people are staying has been rising. And that's
In other
one
words,
of the reasons.
the length of time between arrest and trial?
The length of time between the time the judge puts you in and when your case is finally resolved, whether you plead or you go to trial. And that has just risen astronomically. So, important here is that jails are different from prisons. Jails are largely for people who have not yet been convicted of a crime, and they're held pending the disposition of their case. So these are not, for the most part, sentenced prisoners. And yet when you look, so it's supposed to be people who are there for a relatively short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at these numbers, about a quarter of the population has been there for more than a year.
Why?
And maybe a
Not
third
enough.
of those.
Maybe a third of those. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and maybe a third of those, 2 or more years.
Wow. Is that because not enough judges, or why would that length of time have been expanding on average?
It is, everyone has a piece of this, right? It's, is corrections able to get people to court on time? Literally something that mechanical and simple. Does the judge know that the defendant is there and call them up to court? Has the defense lawyer met with the person in advance so that they're ready to have a meaningful court appearance so it doesn't get put over for a couple of months? And so one of the central, although everybody has a role, one of the central drivers has to be the courts to organize and to move along cases, consistent with fairness. And that has been an enormous effort. And it's been, a focus of the Chief Judge Lippman when he was there, of Chief Judge DiFiore when she was there, of the Chief Judge now. And it's just been enormously difficult to move.
And it seems so ironic to me, just from my understanding of what happened over those particular years that you're referring to, almost the entire length of the de Blasio administration, from 2014, when he started as mayor, through at least the beginning of 2020, crime had been going down in New York City.
Yeah.
So I imagine for you as criminal justice policy advisor there, you were seeing fewer arrests, and yet the length of time being incarcerated at Rikers before a plea or a trial, finish the case, was expanding for people. It's
Yeah,
hard for me to make sense of.
Yeah, this has been a particular problem in the past couple of years. Um, 2017 to 2019 were just about the lowest crime stats on record in New York City. And it was accompanied by the lowest rate of incarceration since the city has been, keeping track of that. And the reason for that were a whole bunch of different things. But one of them was this effort on the part of the cops with respect to arrests, on DAs, the court system, others, to really have the lightest touch possible. So when de Blasio came in, there were about 11,500 people in jail. By March of 2020, when there was really a focused effort to shrink the jail population consistent with safety, the population dropped to about 3,800. So that's to me, that was sort of a signal of what happens when really there's coordination and a focus with urgency about who really should be in jail and for how long.
Decline in the Rikers population gave you more hope that closing the jail and starting anew with 4 other locations around the city that might have better conditions for everybody, both the people incarcerated there and the corrections officers, might be possible. But then crime did start to go up in 2020, and Mayor Adams had his own policies. So do you know the rough number of people at Rikers right now?
About 7,000.
Oh, so
and it's
pretty
up
much
about
doubled.
800 from last year. So it's been consistently rising, since he's taken office.
Which is going to make it more difficult to find enough cells to disperse that population, assuming that rate continues. And we'll get to that.
But again, so important to focus. It's not just how many people go in, because that hasn't really risen that much. The problem has been how long they stay. And that's sort of where the focus, I think, needs to be. The average length of stay for people who are staying more than a month was about 165 days in 2019. It's now 227 days, this year.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, we are in our 30 Issues in 30 Days election series here on the Brian Lehrer Show. Day 17, Issue 17, Closing Rikers Island or Not, as an emerging issue in the New York City mayoral race. Closing it by 2027 is the law, but Curtis Sliwa has always said keep it open. And now, as of last week, Andrew Cuomo wants to keep a jail there too. And we're doing this 30 Issues segment as kind of an oral history and point of view by our guest, who was part of the de Blasio administration when they crafted the Close Rikers plan, Elizabeth Glazer, these days founder of the New York City Policy Journal, Vital City, but she was justice advisor to Mayor Blasio. She also served under Andrew Cuomo when Cuomo was governor, so she's got a foot in both of those camps, as I said at the top of the hour, and her own views are probably most in line with Zohran Mamdani's on Rikers Island. And listeners, we invite your questions, comments, or stories, 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. So continuing with this oral history
Brian,
approach.
could I just interject
one
quick thing?
Go ahead.
We were working hard on this issue, but really I think what the galvanizing force was in getting the mayor to say that he would close Rikers, in motivating then Speaker Mark Viverito to create a commission to study this, was this enormous grassroots effort from advocates, particularly people who had been formerly incarcerated, who were really kind of tireless, up to and including following the mayor to his daily gym workout, but doing all kinds of things to make this issue prominent something that has been so hard in the jails.
And
Because more than anything, everything happens behind closed doors.
I think as part of this oral history, and listeners, I hope you're finding this oral history approach to this issue interesting and informative and thoughtful. We're trying in good faith anyway, as we try to do every day, one way or another. And I think we have one of those grassroots organizers from that period of time calling in. So let's see if Darren in Brooklyn wants to contribute to this oral history in a particular way. Darren, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling.
Thank you so much for having me. Good evening. Yeah, my name is Darren Mack, he, him pronouns, and I'm a co-director of Freedom Agenda, which is a member-led grassroots organization working with directly impacted people for decarceration and system transformation. And I wanted to basically speak to your very first question about the origins of the idea of closing Rikers Island. That came from survivors of Rikers Island, like myself, family members who loved ones who were detained or lost their lives on Rikers Island, like Akeem Browder, the brother of Khalif Browder. And I remember vividly, Khalif Browder, when he was sharing his story, it kind of put a spotlight on what was happening on Rikers Island. And ultimately, he took his own life. And under the radar, organization and partners and myself have been working to launch the campaign on Rikers Island in 2016. And at that same time, the mayor was asked by a journalist, and that's documented, about this idea from advocates to close Rikers Island. He said it was a fantasy. But because of our advocacy and our organizing, we moved New Yorkers to understand that Rikers cannot be fixed, Rikers cannot be reformed, and the only solution was closure. And due to that, we won legislation to close Rikers Island, and we're going to continue to move whoever's the next mayor to understand that and carry out the plan to close Rikers Island ultimately, and remove the stain from our city once and for all.
Darren, you mentioned Khalif Browder, who some of our listeners will remember was a young person who was incarcerated at Rikers Island for a long time before he took his own life. I don't remember the exact length of time, but I know that was part of the story.
Years.
Thank you. And charged only, if I remember correctly, with stealing a backpack. How central do you think Khalif Browder's story and the publicity it got at the time was to actually finally having a policy of closing Rikers Island?
Yes, it was central. Rikers have been out of sight and out of mind of New Yorkers for so long, but his voice, experiencing Rikers Island and the horrors that he suffered, the trauma that caused him to take his own life, put a spotlight on it. And similarly, members of Freedom Agenda and the campaign to close Rikers, are continuing to advocate and organize and come up with solutions. We can mitigate some of the harm that's happening now, like ending solitary confinement and decarcerating and getting people off of Rikers Island, as the city, should be moving forward with closure. So yeah, Khalif Browder's story was definitely pivotal in raising awareness about the horrors that was happening on Rikers.
And why do you think, from your point of view, that things will be any better at the 4 proposed borough jails? Is it not a matter of behavior and policies as opposed to this location versus that location?
Yeah. So for long-term New Yorkers, we know that we had borough facilities next to the courts for decades, and that's how it is all across the country. The jail is next to the court, and we haven't heard stories about the horrors, the brutality, and death coming out of the borough facilities when they existed. And that's because it's the accessibility to your foot families, the accessibility to organize if something is happening in there that we need to raise awareness about accessibility to attorneys. So having a smaller, more humane, accessible, transparent borough jail facility is the way forward. It works, but we also need to continue to decarcerate and with more transparency and to keep the Department of Corrections accountable for what's happening in the borough facilities when we close Rikers Island.
Darren, thank you very much for your call. We really appreciate your contribution. So, Liz Glazer, back to you. What made you think, to the question that I just asked him, when you were working for Mayor de Blasio, that anything would be better for either those incarcerated in New York City or those corrections officers who work there by moving the locations? He talked about them being right near the courts as, you know, as a key to this, that there aren't the horror stories of how people are treated in places around the country where the jails are next to the courts, where, of course, their lawyers would be and where they may be going in and out for their own proceedings. Was that largely it? Or what else led you to believe that things would actually be better at these smaller borough jails?
Yeah, so I think there were a bunch of things, and I think Darren said it beautifully. The jails are out of sight and out of mind. Just think about this year, there have been 12 deaths in the jails, and I don't think it's on anyone's radar, right? And so there's a kind of value to having natural surveillance. You have families going in and visiting, you have lawyers going in and visiting. This issue of court delay that we talked about, that was such a big issue for Khalif Browder too, right? Those 3 years could potentially be shortened when you don't have those same problems in getting people from jail to court. But there's also a question of kind of physically, what does it look like? And how do people feel and how do they live there? You know, the facilities now are crumbling. You burn up in summer. You freeze in the wintertime. They're not designed to have programming and all the kinds of things that would lead to a decent quality of life. But there's something more than it. It's not just that a beautiful building is going to change the conditions of confinement or the real brutality of what happens inside. Something else has to happen at the same time, which is a lot of what this most recent consent decree that's been going on now for 10 years is focusing on, which is you have to change the conditions inside, how officers are trained and supervised, how they treat people who are incarcerated, what kinds of opportunities people who are incarcerated have for classes and programming and other things is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, all you're going to be doing is moving the same brutal conditions from one building to another.
Before we get back to the mayoral candidates, which is, of course, the context for this segment, because they do take different positions, and we'll play clips from all three coming up. Let me take one more call from somebody who says he was incarcerated at Rikers. And if we heard from Darren, the first caller, about the campaign to change things and how they want it changed, I think Brian in Manhattan is going to more describe what some of the conditions are inside that have led people to be so horrified and led to this federal takeover, which is currently the situation. They don't even let the city run Rikers anymore because of what was documented in court. And we may get some oral history that's a personal history from Brian in Manhattan on that, it looks like. Brian, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Thank you. It was a great show. I'm choking up. I got tears in my eyes just listening to this. I survived Rikers Island, but I think even the most hardcore Republican, right? I don't put them all in like fascist camp and just try to pigeonhole. I think most people, if they knew what was actually going on in Rikers Island, they would be horrified. They would be disgusted. I mean, I saw people cut their wrists while guards watched. You know, a couple cells down, somebody hung himself while the guards watch. Matter of fact, I think they ended up arresting and charging guards for watching people. Supervisors watching a prisoner hanging for 5 minutes, 8 minutes. It's horrible. It would shock the conscience. It made me disillusioned in America more than anything else. And I'm no naive kid, you know, but what I saw there, and the fact that they put you, like the first guy, what's his name, Darren, Freedom Agenda, I've seen them guys, and they're good people. But he said about out of sight, out of mind. That's what it is. And people get sent out there. Here, if I could say a couple things, I've been waiting to say this for a long time. Somebody said earlier in the show that when they lowered the Rikers Island population, crime levels went up. Okay, but that's not a cause and effect. What people don't realize, they also had parole reform. And so a lot of people got released from prison. A lot of people, you know, were on parole. And there's no support system. But you can't take something that's been going on for hundreds of years, the structural racism and oppression that's going on here, and then pass a law and say, okay, in 1 year or 2 years, we're going to do an analysis and see what happens. You can't. That's not fair. It's not even honest. But if you think, like in California in prisons, there's like maybe for every incarcerated person, there's one guard, right? That's the numbers,
ratio.
In a whole prison might have thousands of people incarcerated, and there's only hundreds of guards. In New York City, there's more employees than prisoners. There's over 7,000 uniformed guards, and there's another 2,000 civilian employees. How is that possible? Like they're spending over 500.
What's the impact of that ratio in your experience or opinion?
It's oppression. It's like the corruption that goes on there, the violence that they just imagine this. They could take one person out of Rikers Island and put them on an ankle bracelet and send 8 kids to NYU or Columbia for a year. And if you do that for 30 years, imagine you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of people in the community that are now college educated, that now instead of growing up in a single parent home, they have 2-parent homes. I mean, that's what you need to do to address something as overwhelming as structural racism. And Rikers Island and mass incarceration is like, that's the cornerstone of what's wrong. But last thing I'd like to say, Ryan, is it wasn't de Blasio or his administration that pushed close Rikers. It was like survivors and civil rights activists, people that saw what was going on there. And I mean, and pushed the government into it. And raised awareness. The same thing pushing the feds. But just imagine a world where instead of locking up people for everything, people that have mental health issues get mental health care, and people that have drug issues have drug care, and that the idea should be, let's send as many kids to school as we can and not jail. It's almost like, I remember Jesse Jackson. People used to scoff. Remember when he used to say it costs more to send somebody to jail than it does to Yale? Yeah. I mean, Brian, it's never been more true. Let me leave it there. Thank you. Thank you. We have to do something. Thank you for your contribution to this segment. Liz, so much there. What were you thinking? What would you like to react to from Brian's call before we get back to the clips of the candidates?
So Brian's exactly right. And it's not just the level of violence. It is the kind of violence. He was talking about Michael Nieves, who got a razor in the facility, slit his throat in front of the guards, and they watched as he bled out. Another person that he referred to hung himself in front of a captain who was making jokes as he died. Herman Diaz, who choked on an orange because the facility was not staffed appropriately. And he's exactly right. It's not a question of money. we spend about $500,000 a year on each person incarcerated. It's not a question of staffing. We have the most richly staffed jail system in the country, and it's not a question of oversight. We have many different oversight facilities. And it's hard to, what I'm about to say is going to sound so kind of bloodless in comparison to these horrendous problems, but it is a problem of management and oversight and supervision and accountability, that this is an organization that just doesn't run. And as a result, the kind of horrendous things that the caller just referred to are happening on a too regular a basis. And it's why I think the federal courts have finally stepped in for what is a very extraordinary remedy, which is a receiver.
But if those conditions were that extreme, why was it not in control of the mayor, de Blasio, when you worked for him in that administration, or Adam since, to change it?
I think it requires more power than even the mayor has, whether it was under us or under under Adams, and the last corrections commissioner that de Blasio had, Vinnie Schiraldi, urged a receivership.
Meaning a federal government or court takeover.
Right. So that what the court does is appoint somebody who is independent of politics, and who can cut through the red tape and all kinds of regulations and other things that mean that staffing doesn't go right and that accountability doesn't go right. And this person essentially really stands in the shoes of the mayor to operate the facility. They are the executive. It will depend very much on who the person is who's appointed. But this is an issue that even the Monitor has now, over the past few years, essentially said the place has to be rebuilt from the ground up. There are 300 more provisions on the consent decree to try and get violence down, violence which is now well above the unconstitutional levels that it was when the decree was entered into. And the Monitor has said, you know what? Don't even worry about those. Just focus on the four things that matter: figuring out security, management, supervision, accountability, i.e., everything. Rebuild the organization.
So when we come back from a break, we'll play clips of the three mayoral candidates on what they would do to address conditions at Rikers, including closing it. And you said build from the ground up. That's part of what's new from Andrew Cuomo when he says no, he no longer supports closing Rikers Island. He is talking about building from the ground up just on that site. So we'll hear that clip and more from the other candidates and continue with Liz Glazer. 30 issues in 30 days, issue 17, closing Rikers or not as an issue in the New York City mayoral race. Stay with us. Brian Miller on WNYC, issue 17 in 30 issues in 30 days, our election series with Elizabeth Glazer, founder of the New York City policy journal Vital City. In the last few years, she worked for Mayor de Blasio when the closed Rikers plan was being created. She worked for Andrew Cuomo before that when Cuomo was governor. And I want to go back as we discuss closing Rikers or not as an emerging issue in the New York City mayoral race. Go back and play the clip of Cuomo that made news last week that we played at the top of the segment. Play it again because that was 35 minutes ago. We're trying to give these issues a lot of oxygen to really explore them. I hope this is serving you, listeners. But here's Cuomo last week, who came out with this new position. He used to be for closing Rikers Island.
We should rebuild new state-of-the-art jails on Rikers Island, provide free bus service, and use those existing sites for housing and commercial development.
Okay, so that's the plan. And here's one of the reasons that he gave at that announcement as he compared all the delays in building the 4 borough jails that would replace Rikers Island. He compares it to, even though he uses the wrong word, to a big boondoggle construction project in Boston a number of years ago.
Let's make a major start by stopping a major debacle, which is the new jail construction to replace Rikers Island. The writing is on the wall. It promises to be New York City's big ditch. It is already years late, billions over budget, and obsolete.
So he meant Big Dig, which was the name of that transportation renovation project in Boston. My understanding is that it worked out pretty well eventually, but Bostonians were pretty ticked as it dragged on and snarled traffic for a long time along the way. So anyway, there's Cuomo. And later that day, last Wednesday, Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic nominee, reacted.
Mr. Cuomo's proposal to take that which is broken, that which is morally bankrupt, that which is a stain on our city, and to keep it open. It's a betrayal not only of the law as it stands today, but also of what New Yorkers actually want.
So Mamdani reacting to Cuomo. Here's Republican nominee Curtis Sliwa reacting to Cuomo.
In 2019, he has a press conference. We must close Rikers Island. 2 weeks ago, he once again reiterated it should have been closed a long time ago. Where would he have put the inmates back then? You can't trust Cuomo. He's the flip-flop guy.
So to that specific point of history in the Curtis Sliwa clip, Liz, true, what did Cuomo do in 2019 toward closing Rikers?
Yeah, I think that this was not really, this was a city issue. This was not something the state was involved in. So I have to say that I'm sort of blanking a little bit on what he did.
Maybe Curtis was referring to the bail reform law?
Could be. 2019 was bail reform.
Yeah. Well, when did you work for Governor Cuomo?
I worked for him 2013 to 16. So first term.
Period of time when de Blasio was
2011 to 13. Yeah.
So just
when
before
he
de
was first
Blasio started and you joined him.
Yeah.
And was there any discussion at that time of closing Rikers Island as we continue with this oral history?
No.
All right. So how almost everyone says that the 2027 closing date, which is the law right now, is not realistic given construction delays at the proposed borough jails that Cuomo referred there, comparing it to the Big Ditch or the Big Dig from Boston. Do you agree with at least that much?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear, that as far as what the contracts now say and how the building is going, it looks like Manhattan won't be done until 2032. That's their current, prediction. Brooklyn is the earliest, but that's not till 2029. And Queens and Bronx are 2031. So really a long time away.
So let's say Mamdani is elected, who does support the current law and wants to close Rikers Island and transition to the borough-based jails. How does that happen?
Yeah, I don't think it does happen by 2027. And I would say that, as the date recedes further and further, the ability to actually fix things on Rikers also recedes. So because everything, now that there's a 2027 date by which they're supposed to be off, the city can't use, for a whole bunch of kind of technical reasons, capital dollars in order to fix things. And so the facilities deteriorate ever more. And I do think that it's a real question about, is something that is state of the art, air conditioned, has good sight lines, is a decent facility? Does that get built?
Which
right
is
now
the Cuomo
on
proposal,
Rikers?
I think, right? To replace the old decrepit Rikers buildings with this new state of the art, that was his term in the clip, jail or jails.
The question is, how do you get from here to there? And what do you do right now for people who are on Rikers? And there are a couple of things that have to be done and should be done whether people move off the island or elsewhere, such as reduce the population. But I think it is a question whether at least one facility is built on Rikers Island that is decent as you begin to get people off, whether you open the hospital beds, there are supposed to be 330 hospital beds that are opened, whether you figure out other ways, whether you accelerate the Brooklyn facility, which is closest to being built. But it is an impossible situation right now.
Thank you for your oral history. Thank you for your policy analysis. Liz Glazer, who now has founded and runs the New York City policy journal, Vital City. We'll be reading Vital City. Thank you very much for joining us for 30 Issues in 30 Days, Issue 17, Closing Rikers Island or Not, as an emerging issue in the New York City mayoral race. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks very much, Brian.
And again, tomorrow, Issue 18, which is going to be, should New York City move these mayoral elections to the same year as the presidential elections? That'll be tomorrow. But we'll turn the page and talk about something else right after this.